The needle shouldn't have been doing that. I'd been watching the temperature gauge in the secondary cooling loop for maybe 20 minutes, and the damn thing kept jumping around like it had a mind of its own. 68 degrees 1 second, then spiking to 93, then dropping back down to 72. Made no sense whatsoever. 11 years I'd been working the overnight shift at Palisades, and I'd never seen anything like it. The secondary cooling system had triple redundancies built in, backup sensors, automatic fail-safes, the whole 9 yards. If one gauge went screwy, the others would catch it. But all 3 readings were dancing around together, like they were following some pattern I couldn't figure out. I tapped the glass face of the main display. Sometimes that helped with the older analog gauges, though this was all digital. Force of habit, I guess. The numbers kept jumping. 79, 86, 64. I pulled out the logbook and started writing down the readings, trying to catch the pattern. My handwriting looked like chicken scratch in the dim light of the control room, but I'd learned to be thorough about everything. Nuclear power doesn't give you second chances. The whole building hummed around me with that steady drone you get used to after a while. Pumps cycling, ventilation running, the low throb of machinery that never stops. During the day shift, you had 30 or 40 people scattered around the plant. At night, it was just me and maybe 6 other guys spread across the whole facility. Made you feel small. Temperature jumped to 97. That got my attention. I leaned forward in my chair and squinted at the screen. 97 was pushing into the yellow zone. Not dangerous yet, but worth keeping an eye on. Then it dropped back to 71. I'd seen equipment failures before. Usually they failed in predictable ways. Sensors going dead, readings stuck at one number, gradual drift over time. This was different. The readings were all over the map, but they stayed within normal operating ranges. Like the system was confused but not actually broken. My shift supervisor, Brooke Brown, always said, trust your instruments first. Trust your gut second. But when the instruments were acting like this, what were you supposed to trust? I reached for the radio clipped to my belt. The thing was older than dirt and weighed about as much as a brick, but it worked. Had to hold the antenna just right to get a clear signal to the main building. Control to Supervisor Brown. Over. Static crackled for a few seconds. Then Brooke's voice came through, clear and steady like always. Supervisor Brown here. Go ahead, Control. I'm seeing some unusual readings on the secondary cooling loop. Temperature gauge is fluctuating outside normal parameters. Copy that. What kind of fluctuations? I looked down at my notes. Jumping between 64 and 97 degrees over the past 20 minutes. No apparent pattern. All 3 sensors showing the same behavior. There was a pause. Brooke had been working at Palisades for 20 years, since before I even got out of high school. If she'd seen something like this before, she'd know what to do. Roger, Control. Log the anomaly and continue monitoring. Any other systems showing irregularities? I scanned the board. Dozens of gauges and displays showing pressure readings, flow rates, reactor temperature, containment status. Everything else looked normal. Negative. Just the secondary cooling loop. Understood. Maintain standard observation protocol. Report any changes immediately. Copy that. I clipped the radio back to my belt and turned to the logbook again. Standard observation protocol meant taking readings every 15 minutes and noting anything out of the ordinary. Not exactly exciting work, but that was the point. Nuclear power was supposed to be boring. The temperature gauge read 73 degrees. Steady for maybe 10 seconds, then it jumped to 88. I wrote it down. Outside the control room windows, I could see the lights of the main building across the compound. Half a mile of frozen ground between us, with the access road cutting a straight line through the snow. The parking lot lights cast yellow circles on the pavement, and beyond that, everything disappeared into darkness. It was the kind of cold February night that made your teeth ache just thinking about going outside. Wind chill probably pushing 20 below. The lake would be frozen solid this time of year, ice stretching out to the horizon like a white desert. I'd grown up around here, and I still wasn't used to how empty everything looked in winter. The gauge jumped to 94 degrees, then settled back to 76. Maybe there was something wrong with the display system itself. Could be a software glitch or interference from somewhere, though I couldn't think of what would cause interference like this. The control systems were shielded 6 ways from Sunday. I reached over to the external camera controls. We had 8 cameras positioned around the facility: parking lot, main entrance, cooling intake, storage areas. Mostly they showed nothing but snow and shadows. But it was part of the routine. Check the cameras every hour. Make sure nothing looked out of place. I cycled through the first few feeds. Parking lot, empty except for the handful of cars belonging to the overnight crew. Main entrance, nothing moving. Storage area, same as always. Then I switched to the camera that looked out toward the lake. I stopped breathing for a second. The ice was glowing. Not bright, not like a floodlight or anything. More like moonlight, except there wasn't a moon tonight. A soft, pale blue light that seemed to come from underneath the surface, spreading out in patches across the frozen lake, some areas brighter than others, like there were hot spots scattered around. I blinked hard and looked again. Still there. My first thought was that something was wrong with the camera. Maybe the sensor was picking up infrared heat or some kind of electrical interference, but the light looked real. It moved slightly, shifting and pulsing like something alive. I'd been staring at Lake Michigan from this building for 11 years. I knew what it was supposed to look like. This wasn't it. The temperature gauge jumped to 96 degrees, and suddenly I wasn't thinking about equipment failures anymore. I stared at the screen until my eyes started watering. Had to be some kind of equipment malfunction, maybe a camera lens issue or interference from the plant's electromagnetic systems. Because what I was looking at couldn't be real. The frozen surface of Heron Lake glowed, not the harsh white of floodlights or the orange wash from sodium lamps. This was something else entirely, a faint bioluminescence spreading across the ice like phosphorescent algae blooming in warm ocean water. Soft blue-green pulses that reminded me of those nature documentaries where they film plankton lighting up under a boat's wake. Except this was January in Michigan, and that ice measured 2 feet thick if it measured an inch. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Still there. The glow wasn't uniform either. It moved in waves, rippling outward from different points on the lake's surface, each pulse a little brighter than the last, like someone was dropping stones into luminous water. But the water was solid ice, and there wasn't anyone out there to drop anything. My hand moved to the radio before I'd consciously decided to call it in, then stopped. What the hell was I supposed to say? "Hey, Brooke, the lake's glowing like a Christmas ornament." She'd think I'd been hitting the coffee too hard, or maybe sampling whatever they kept in that unmarked bottle in the break room fridge. But I had to document this somehow. Protocol demanded it. Anything unusual in the plant's vicinity got logged and reported, even if it seemed unrelated to operations. I reached for the incident logbook, then hesitated again. How do you write up something that shouldn't exist? The radio crackled to life before I could figure it out. "Arlo, you copy?" Brooke's voice cut through the static, sharp and clear. No hint of her usual end-of-shift fatigue. I grabbed the handset. "Yeah, I'm here." "You observing the same phenomenon on your screens that I'm seeing out here?" My stomach dropped. She could see it too. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't just equipment failure or sleep-deprived hallucinations. "The lake?" "Affirmative. Started about 2 minutes ago from my position. You getting clear visuals on the external cameras?" I switched between camera feeds, cycling through the different angles we had on the cooling water intake. Every screen showed the same thing, that impossible blue-green glow spreading across the ice like foxfire. Clear as day. You have any idea what could? The control room lights flickered. Just for a second, maybe less. Long enough for the fluorescence to dim and throw everything into shadow before brightening again. I looked up at the fixtures, waiting for another flutter, but they held steady. Then they died completely. The sudden darkness hit like a physical blow. 11 years of night shifts had accustomed me to the control room's constant illumination. The glow from monitors, indicator lights, status panels. Now all of it was gone, leaving only the faint luminescence from the emergency exit signs and the weird blue-green light filtering through the reinforced windows. I didn't panic. Training kicked in automatically, the same way it always did when systems failed. Count to 3, assess the situation, follow protocol. The backup generators would engage within 10 seconds. They always did. 7 seconds later, I heard them spin up. The diesel engines coughed to life somewhere below us, their rumble vibrating through the concrete floor. Emergency lighting flooded the control room, harsh white spots that threw everything into stark relief. The monitoring systems began their restart sequence, screens flickering as they powered back up. But something was wrong with the readings. The primary coolant temperature display came online first, and I watched the numbers climb with growing unease. 91 degrees, 94, 97. The system was designed to operate at a steady 82 degrees with automatic safeguards that should have kicked in long before now. I reached for the emergency protocol manual, then stopped. My hands knew these procedures better than my brain did after 11 years. Coolant temperature spike meant potential system breach. Initiate isolation protocols. Notify the shift supervisor. Begin controlled shutdown if temperatures exceeded safety thresholds. But something deeper than training was telling me to hold off. This wasn't a normal equipment failure. The timing was too perfect. The lake lighting up just minutes before our power failed, then coolant temperatures spiking the moment the generators engaged. Like whatever was happening out there had somehow connected to our systems. I'd never believed in intuition before. Always figured it was just pattern recognition your conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. But standing in that emergency-lit control room, watching impossible readings climb on screens that shouldn't have been affected by anything happening on a frozen lake 200 yards away, something in my gut was screaming that this situation had already moved beyond any procedure manual ever written. Through the reinforced windows, I could see the glow intensifying. What had started as faint phosphorescence was now bright enough to cast shadows on the snow-covered shore. But it wasn't random anymore. The light was organizing itself into patterns, geometric shapes that formed and dissolved and reformed in different configurations. Spirals that started small and expanded outward until they reached the lake's edges, then collapsed back into points of concentrated brilliance. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The patterns weren't chaotic. They followed some kind of logic, each spiral building on the last, each pulse more intense than the one before. Like a language I couldn't read but somehow recognized. The coolant temperature hit 102 degrees. My training said initiate emergency shutdown. My gut said wait and watch. Because whatever was happening out there, I had the feeling we were about to find out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. And I wasn't sure our procedures were going to be enough to handle what we found at the bottom. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the hum of the control room like a knife through butter. Arlo, you getting this data on your end? Brooke's voice carried that edge it got when something wasn't adding up right. 20 years in this business, and I'd learned to read every inflection in her tone. This one meant trouble. I glanced at my secondary monitors, cross-referencing what she was seeing. Yeah, I'm seeing it. What the hell's going on with the radiation readings? That's just it. Static popped through her transmission. They're not spiking. They're dropping. Fast. My hand froze halfway to the console. Dropping radiation levels during a potential reactor incident was like watching water flow uphill. Didn't happen. Couldn't happen. The laws of physics didn't take coffee breaks. How much of a drop? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. 30% below normal background levels and falling. It's like... She paused, and I could hear her breathing over the radio. Brooke never paused. not when she was reading data. It's like something's actively absorbing the energy the reactor's producing. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. I stared at the readouts, numbers that should have been climbing steadily into the danger zone, instead showing a steady decline toward impossible territory. Radiation doesn't just disappear. It decays over time, sure, but we're talking thousands of years for some isotopes, not minutes. Brooke, run that again. Something's wrong with your equipment. Already did. 3 times. Arlo, I'm coming to the control room. Right now. Her voice carried the kind of certainty that made arguments pointless. And we need to contact the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Whatever's happening out here, it's beyond anything in our manual. The NRC. Christ. Last time we'd called them was for a false alarm during a training exercise 2 years back. Some inspector named Montgomery had spent 3 days crawling through our procedures with a fine-tooth comb, treating us like we didn't know a control rod from a cooling pipe. The memory left a sour taste in my mouth. Copy that, I said into the radio. I'll start pulling the emergency contact protocols. The line went quiet, except for the soft hiss of static. I set the handset down and turned back to the bank of monitors showing the lake. The glow was still there, those geometric patterns dancing across the ice like some kind of frozen aurora. But now I wasn't just watching them anymore. I was studying them. My eyes tracked the luminescent lines as they shifted and pulsed, and slowly a pattern started emerging from what had looked like random chaos. The brightest points weren't scattered randomly across the lake's surface. They were converging, moving with purpose toward a specific point. The intake pipes. I felt my stomach drop. The massive concrete tubes that drew lake water into our cooling system sat just beneath the surface, maybe 200 yards from shore. From my vantage point in the control room, I could see where they disappeared into the ice, marked by the subtle depression in the frozen surface where warmer water had prevented the lake from freezing solid. The geometric patterns weren't just dancing, they were flowing, streaming toward those intake pipes like iron filings drawn to a magnet. I grabbed the radio again. Brooke, the glow on the lake. It's moving toward the cooling system intakes. Static. Then, how fast? Good question. I pressed my face closer to the reinforced glass, trying to judge the movement. The luminescence didn't flow like normal liquid, more like mercury, thick and purposeful, following channels in the ice I couldn't see but somehow existed. Bright threads of light converging from all directions toward the point where lake water fed into our reactor's cooling loop. Hard to say. Maybe walking speed, but it's definitely heading for the pipes. Jesus. Brooke's voice crackled through the speaker. I'm 10 minutes out. Don't touch anything until I get there. Copy. I set the radio down and checked the digital clock mounted above the main console. 3:47 a.m. The numbers glowed red against the dark background, steady and reliable in a way that nothing else seemed to be anymore. In 13 minutes, I'd gone from monitoring routine overnight operations to watching something that defied every principle of nuclear physics I'd ever learned. And it was getting worse. The luminescence wasn't just moving now, it was accelerating. What had been a slow drift was becoming something more urgent, more deliberate, like whatever was causing this glow had figured out where it wanted to go and decided subtlety wasn't necessary anymore. I watched the patterns flow across the ice, following paths that seemed to exist just beneath the frozen surface. The light moved like liquid mercury, thick and heavy, carrying purpose I couldn't understand but could feel in my bones. Every instinct I'd developed working around radioactive material was screaming warnings my rational mind couldn't process, because this wasn't just some weird atmospheric phenomenon anymore. This was something coming for us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was causing the radiation levels to drop, whatever was absorbing the energy our reactor produced, it wasn't content to stay out there on the lake. It was moving toward the cooling system. toward the heart of our facility. My hands started sweating inside my work gloves. In 11 years of overnight shifts, I'd handled equipment failures, false alarms, and one genuine emergency when a cooling pump seized up during a summer heat wave. But I'd never dealt with anything that seemed to have intention behind it. The geometric patterns continued their hypnotic dance across the ice, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Bright threads weaving together into complex designs that hurt to look at directly, like staring into a kaleidoscope that someone had cranked up past human perception. But underneath the mesmerizing display was something that made my skin crawl. It was coming for the reactor. Whatever this was, wherever it came from, it had found our facility and decided we were exactly what it was looking for. I kept my eyes fixed on those flowing patterns of light, counting the minutes until Brooke arrived, and tried not to think about what would happen when that luminescence reached the intake pipes. Seeing something in the corridor between, the radio cut to static, not the usual interference we got when the wind picked up, or the crackling you'd hear during electrical storms. Dead static. The kind that made your skin crawl because it meant the transmission hadn't just weakened. It had stopped. I stared at the radio unit mounted above my console, waiting for Brooke's voice to cut back through. She'd been mid-sentence, reporting from somewhere between the control building and the turbine hall. That corridor was maybe 200 yards of covered walkway with emergency lighting every 20 feet. Nothing should have interrupted her signal there. "Brooke," I keyed the mic. "Come back." Static. My fingers found the emergency frequency switch. Protocol said to contact the main office if we lost communication with field personnel during an incident. I flipped to channel 7 and pressed the transmit button. "Plant operations to main office. We have a communication issue with field supervisor. Please respond." More static. Not even the background hum you'd normally get from an open channel. Just that dead, empty sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried the landline next. The phone sat right there on my desk, black plastic receiver that had probably been installed when the plant first went online. I picked it up and got dial tone, which was something. Punched in the main office extension and listened to it ring, and ring, and ring. 12 rings before I hung up. Nobody at the main office let a phone ring 12 times, not during normal operations, and definitely not during an incident. They had people manning phones around the clock. My cell phone was charging on the windowsill behind my chair. I grabbed it and checked the signal strength. No bars, not even one flickering bar that might carry a text message. The screen showed no service, where the carrier name should have been. That's when the cold really started settling into my stomach, because losing radio contact was one thing. Losing the landline was another. But losing cell service, that required something bigger than equipment failure. Cell towers didn't just stop working because a cooling pump hiccuped. I was reaching for the radio again when the control board started lighting up like a Christmas tree. Warning lights I'd never seen before flickered to life across the main panel. Red, amber, and blue indicators that weren't supposed to exist on equipment this old. The temperature readout for the secondary cooling loop showed -47 degrees. -47. Water doesn't get that cold without freezing solid, and frozen water would have burst every pipe in the system. The pressure differential gauge read numbers that made no sense. According to the display, we had negative pressure in a closed-loop system. Physics doesn't work that way. You can't have water flowing uphill against gravity while maintaining negative pressure, unless you're defying laws that have been carved in stone since before my grandfather was born. But the radiation monitor was what really made my hands start shaking. The digital readout scrolled through isotope signatures I'd never seen in 11 years of working this plant. Our fuel rods contained uranium-235 and uranium-238, standard reactor material with signatures I could recognize in my sleep. But these readings showed isotopes with atomic weights that didn't match anything in the periodic table. elements that shouldn't exist. I pulled up the system diagnostics on my computer terminal, ran every test sequence I could access from the control room. Water flow rates, electrical systems, backup generators, emergency protocols. The computer processed each request and delivered results that contradicted everything I thought I knew about how this place operated. According to the diagnostics, water was flowing through pipes that showed as disconnected on the schematic. Electrical current was running through circuits that had been shut down for maintenance 3 weeks ago. The backup generators showed active status, even though I could see them sitting silent through the window. "Brooke, please respond." I tried the radio again, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. "I need you to check in." Nothing. I cycled through every frequency we used. Emergency channels, maintenance frequencies, the direct line to the security office. Static on all of them. Not even the background chatter you'd normally pick up from the county sheriff's department or the state highway patrol. My fingers drummed against the console as I stared at the screens. Every gauge and monitor showed impossible readings. Temperature, pressure, radiation, electrical load. None of it made sense. But the equipment wasn't malfunctioning. These weren't random numbers or error codes. The displays showed precise measurements that followed patterns, as if something was actually causing these readings. Something was making the water flow backward through disconnected pipes. Something was generating radiation from isotopes that shouldn't exist. Something was creating negative pressure in a closed system. I called Brooke's name into the radio again. And again. My voice echoed back from the concrete walls of the control room, the only sound besides the steady hum of the ventilation system and the soft electronic beeping of the monitoring equipment. The silence stretched out like a living thing. Not just the absence of Brooke's voice, but the complete lack of any human contact. No radio traffic from other plants in the region. No emergency broadcasts from civil authorities. No cell service to reach my sister in town or my buddy Mike who worked the day shift. I was sitting alone in a control room filled with impossible data, watching numbers scroll across screens that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The instruments told me that something ancient and powerful was moving through the frozen infrastructure of the plant, something that could bend reality to its will. But what scared me more than any of that was the silence where Brooke's voice should have been. She'd been out there for 23 minutes now, and I hadn't heard so much as a footstep on the metal walkway outside. No radio check-ins, no updates on her investigation, no casual conversation to fill the dead air between observations. Just silence. And in that silence, I could feel something watching me through the cameras. Something that had been waiting in the cold water for longer than humans had existed. Something that was finally ready to make itself known. The glow hit the intake pipes like liquid light finding its veins. I watched it happen on monitor 3, the one that tracked the primary cooling system. The luminescence flowed through the massive conduits with purpose, not like water or steam, but like something alive that understood exactly where it was going. The pipes themselves started glowing from within, faint at first, then brighter, until the entire intake manifold looked like it had been shot full of molten silver. Wasn't supposed to work that way. Those pipes were steel and concrete, built to handle pressurized water at temperatures that could cook a man in seconds. Nothing should have been able to light them up like Christmas decorations. But there it was, spreading through the cooling loop like luminous blood through arteries. The glow followed every junction, every valve, every connection point in the system. I could trace the entire cooling circuit just by watching that strange light move through it, highlighting infrastructure I'd only ever seen in blueprints and maintenance crawlways. Monitor 4 showed the secondary loop starting to glow. Then 5 picked up the tertiary systems. Whatever this thing was, it understood our cooling network better than most of the engineers who'd designed it. My hands found the radio controls without me thinking about it, Had to tell Brooke what I was seeing, had to get someone else's eyes on this before. The reactor output display caught my attention. Numbers dropping fast. I'd been so focused on watching the glow spread that I'd missed the readings changing. The power output meter showed 850 megawatts, then 820, then 790. Dropping steady, like someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch. But that wasn't how nuclear reactors worked. You didn't just dial down the power like adjusting a thermostat. The control rods moved in measured increments, following procedures that took hours to implement safely. The reaction was either controlled or it wasn't. There was no middle ground where it just gradually faded away. I pulled up the control rod position indicators. All green. Normal depth, normal spacing, exactly where they should be for full power operation. The neutron flux readings looked normal too. Temperature in the reactor core holding steady. So why was our power output dropping like a stone? The answer hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to grab the edge of the console to keep my knees from buckling. The entity wasn't interfering with our reactor. It was feeding on it. All that luminescence flowing through our cooling systems, all that impossible light that shouldn't exist, it was drawing power directly from the nuclear reaction. Not disrupting it, not damaging it, just drinking from it, like a parasite that had found the perfect host. I'd seen enough equipment failures to know what they looked like. Pumps seizing up, pipes bursting, control systems going haywire. This wasn't equipment failure. This was something deliberately and methodically draining our reactor of its energy. And it was doing it without triggering a single safety protocol. 700 megawatts. 680. Still dropping. My throat went dry as I ran the calculations. At this rate, we'd lose primary power within the hour. When that happened, the cooling pumps would switch to backup generators. But those were only designed to run for 72 hours max. If this thing kept feeding, kept draining power from our core, those generators would be all that stood between us and a complete cooling system failure. Without cooling, the fuel rods would overheat. Without cooling, we'd have maybe 6 hours before the reactor core started melting down. But here was the thing that made my hands shake as I stared at those falling numbers. If this entity stopped feeding, if it just disappeared and left our reactor alone, we'd have a different problem entirely. All that nuclear energy it was consuming had to go somewhere. Basic physics. Energy couldn't just vanish into nothing, and if this thing suddenly released everything it had absorbed, I thought about Chernobyl. Thought about the explosion that had torn through that reactor building, spreading radioactive material across half of Europe. Thought about the evacuation zones that were still empty decades later. Our reactor was bigger than Chernobyl's, more modern, more safeguards, but also more fuel, more potential energy stored in those ceramic pellets. If something went wrong here, if all that absorbed power got released at once, the explosion wouldn't just level the plant. It would take out everything within 50 miles. 600 megawatts. 570. The numbers kept falling, and I found myself caught between two kinds of disaster, both of them impossible to survive. Let the entity keep feeding, and we'd lose cooling. The fuel rods would melt, the containment would fail, and we'd have a slow-motion catastrophe that would contaminate the entire region for generations. But if the entity stopped feeding, if it released all that stored energy in one sudden burst, there wouldn't be time for evacuation, wouldn't be time for anything except a flash of light brighter than the sun, followed by silence. I sat there staring at the monitors, watching that luminous presence spread through our systems like infection through a bloodstream, and tried to wrap my head around the impossible calculation I was facing. How do you choose between two different ways for everything to end? 500 megawatts, 480. The glow was reaching the heat exchangers now, lighting up components I'd only seen during maintenance shutdowns. The entire cooling system looked like something out of a science fiction movie, all flowing light and impossible beauty. Beautiful and deadly as hell. I thought about calling Brooke, thought about activating the emergency protocols, thought about hitting the big red button that would trigger an automatic shutdown. But what good would any of that do? Our procedures weren't designed for this. Our training didn't cover supernatural entities that fed on nuclear reactions. Hell, our training barely covered regular equipment failures, and those happened according to the laws of physics. 400 megawatts, 350. The glow kept spreading, reaching into every corner of our cooling network, and I kept searching my mind for any solution that didn't end with everyone within 50 miles either dead or displaced, kept running scenarios, kept working the problem like they'd taught us in training. But every scenario I could think of ended the same way. Badly. The only question was how badly, and for whom. That's when the light found me. I felt it before I saw it. A tickle in my nose like the first hint of a cold coming on. The air circulation system had been running steady all night. The same low hum it always made, but something different was moving through those vents now. The glow started seeping in through the intake grills above the main console. Wisps of it at first, like someone had lit a cigarette in the ductwork and the smoke was drifting down. Except this smoke glowed with that same pale blue-green I'd been watching on the monitors. It pooled in the corners where the walls met the ceiling, gathered in the spaces behind the equipment racks. Luminous fog that moved with purpose, not just drifting but flowing like it knew exactly where it wanted to go. My hands were still on the control panel, still running diagnostics that weren't telling me anything useful, but I couldn't stop watching that light as it filled the room around me. The warmth hit me next, started in my fingertips, this gentle heat that spread up through my palms and into my wrists. Not like touching something hot, more like stepping into a warm bath after being out in the cold too long. My muscles relaxed without me telling them to. The tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders just melted away. For the first time in hours, I felt calm. That should have been my first warning. Nothing about this situation called for calm. I had readings that made no sense, equipment acting up, and now some kind of luminescent gas filtering through the ventilation system. Should have been reaching for the emergency protocols. Should have been calling for backup. Instead, I just stood there watching those patterns swirl through the air around me. They were beautiful. The thought came unbidden, and I didn't try to push it away. Because it was true. The light moved in spirals and eddies that reminded me of water, but more complex, more deliberate. Like watching a dancer who knew every step by heart, performing a routine they'd practiced for centuries. My breathing slowed. Deep, even breaths that filled my lungs with that warm, glowing mist. Each inhalation brought more of that strange comfort, that sense of everything being exactly as it should be. The fear was still there. Had to be, right? I wasn't stupid. But it felt distant now, muffled, like trying to remember a bad dream after you'd been awake for a while. Arlo. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Might have been the radio. Might have been the entity itself, speaking directly into my head. Sounded like Brooke, but softer somehow. Gentler than she ever was during our regular shifts. "Just wait," the voice said. "Let it finish." Made sense. Whatever was happening here, fighting it would only make things worse. Better to stay calm. Better to watch and learn and understand what this thing was trying to show me. The patterns in the light were getting more complex, fractals within fractals, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly but felt familiar somehow. Like I'd seen them before in dreams I couldn't quite remember. "Join us," the voice whispered. "Join the light." My legs felt heavy, not tired, just peaceful. Like I'd been standing for too long and it was time to sit down. Time to rest. Time to stop worrying about gauges and protocols and all the small, meaningless things that filled up a person's days. The warmth had spread through my entire body now, fingers and toes tingling with it, chest full of that glowing mist that made every breath feel like the first breath of spring after a long winter. I could feel my will slipping away, not violently, not like someone grabbing it from me, more like letting go of a rope I'd been holding too tight for too long, just releasing it and trusting that everything would work out fine. The light was inside me now, behind my eyes, flowing through my bloodstream, settling into my bones like it belonged there, like it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to wake up. Part of me, some small, distant part that still remembered why I was here, tried to speak up, tried to remind me about procedures and safety protocols and the fact that nuclear plants weren't supposed to glow like Christmas trees. But that voice was getting quieter, harder to hear over the gentle hum of the light as it filled every corner of the control room, every corner of me. I was reaching for something. My hand moved without conscious thought, fingers stretching toward a switch I'd never had to use in 11 years of working this job. The emergency manual override. Big red switch behind a plastic cover, mounted on the wall next to the main console. The kind of thing they made you memorize in training but told you to pray you'd never need. Because pulling that switch meant flooding the reactor core with liquid boron, poisoning the nuclear reaction so completely that it would never restart. The plant would go permanently offline, millions of dollars in damage, cleanup costs that would probably bankrupt the company. And my career? Gone. Who was going to hire the guy who nuked a perfectly good reactor because he thought he saw some lights? But I understood something now, with that warm glow pulsing through my veins. The entity, whatever it was, fed on the nuclear reaction. Needed that controlled fission to sustain itself, to grow, to spread beyond the boundaries of this little plant beside a frozen lake. Without the reactor, it would have nothing left to consume. My fingers found the plastic cover, flipped it open with a sharp crack that cut through the gentle hum of the light. The voice in my head, Brooke's voice, or the thing wearing her voice, suddenly wasn't so gentle anymore. "Wait," it said, urgent now. "Don't." I pulled the switch. The reactor died instantly, not the gradual shutdown we'd trained for, not the controlled descent through power levels with cooling pumps running and steam bleeding off in measured increments. The whole damn thing just stopped, like someone had unplugged it from the wall. I watched it happen on every monitor at once. The temperature readings flatlined. The pressure gauges dropped to 0. The turbine rotation indicators went dark. 47 years of continuous operation, and it all ended in the space of maybe 3 heartbeats. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was watching the glow respond like it knew exactly what had happened. On monitor 3, the luminescence that had been flowing through the intake pipes started to flicker. Not the steady pulse I'd been tracking all night, but something frantic. Desperate, maybe. Like it was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The light dimmed first in the pipes closest to the reactor core. Made sense, I guess. That's where the power had been strongest. But instead of just fading out, the glow began to move. Started flowing backward through the cooling system, gathering itself up like mercury rolling uphill. I leaned forward in my chair, watching the monitors as the light retreated through the primary cooling loop, then the secondary, pulling back through every pipe and conduit it had touched, moving with purpose now, not the random drift I'd seen earlier. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the control room in that sickly red glow they use for plant failures, but I barely noticed it. My eyes were fixed on monitor 7, the one that showed the lake's surface. The luminescence poured back out through the intake pipes like water finding its level. Spread across the ice in those same flowing patterns I'd watched all night, but moving in reverse now. Gathering itself into streams, then rivulets, then concentrated beams of light that carved through the frozen surface like it was tissue paper. And then it was gone. Just like that. One moment the entire lake was lit up like someone had installed Christmas lights under the ice, and the next it was dark water and snow-covered shoreline. Nothing but the normal glow of distant towns on the horizon and the red blinking light on the radio tower across the bay. I sat there in the emergency lighting listening to the silence where 47 years of mechanical humming used to be, and tried to make sense of what I just witnessed. The thing, whatever it was, had retreated into the depths of Lake Michigan. Back to wherever it had been waiting all these years, all these decades, patient and eternal beneath the frozen surface, waiting for the next time someone would build something powerful enough to draw it back toward the light. That's what I told the emergency responders when they found me at dawn. Well, tried to tell them. The first truck pulled up around 6:30, just as the sky was starting to turn that pale gray color that meant morning was coming whether you were ready for it or not. I'd been sitting in the control room for maybe 4 hours by then, running through every procedure I could think of, trying to restart systems that wouldn't respond to any input I gave them. The reactor was dead. Not just shut down. Dead, like something had reached into its core and switched off whatever makes atoms split and heat water and spin turbines. You, Rodriguez? The lead responder was a guy maybe my age, stocky build, wearing one of those reflective vests that emergency crews always seem to have. Had a clipboard in his hand, and that look people get when they're trying to figure out if you're part of the problem or part of the solution. Yeah, I'm the one who called it in. What happened here? That's when I found out how hard it is to explain something when you don't really understand it yourself. I tried telling him about the temperature fluctuations, about the glow in the lake, about watching the light flow through the cooling system like it was alive. Tried to describe how the reactor had just stopped, all at once, without any of the warning signs we'd been trained to watch for. He wrote it all down, nodding at the right moments, asking the kind of questions emergency responders are supposed to ask. But I could see it in his eyes, that polite skepticism people get when they think you might be having some kind of breakdown. "Equipment malfunction," he said finally, closing his clipboard. "Happens more than you'd think with these older plants. We'll get the investigators in here, let them sort out the details." The investigators showed up 3 days later. Lead guy was named Montgomery. Remy Montgomery, according to his business card. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation. Mid-50s, soft around the middle, wearing a suit that looked like it had seen better decades. Had that bureaucrat's way of asking questions like he already knew the answers and was just checking to see if you'd lie about them. He spent 2 weeks at the plant, went through every system, every procedure, every maintenance record from the past 5 years. Interviewed everyone who'd been on duty that night, which was basically just me and Brooke. Except they couldn't interview Brooke. They found her in the corridor between the control room and the reactor building, maybe an hour after the emergency crews arrived. Alive, breathing, pulse steady, but completely unresponsive, like someone had just switched her off. Her eyes were the worst part. They were open, staring straight ahead, but they reflected light from sources that weren't there. Stand in front of her at the right angle and you could see this faint luminescence in her pupils, not like a camera flash or the reflection you get from headlights. Something deeper. Something that seemed to come from inside her skull. The doctors couldn't explain it. Ran every test they could think of. CAT scans, MRIs, blood work, neurological exams. Everything came back normal. Brain activity, reflexes, physical responses. But she never spoke again. Never acknowledged that anyone else was in the room with her. They transferred her to a long-term care facility in Grand Rapids after 6 months. Place that specializes in, well, cases like hers. People who are technically alive but not really there anymore. I visited her a few times before I left town. Sat next to her bed, tried talking to her about normal things, the weather, how the Tigers were doing, whether she remembered that time we'd fixed the bearing problem in Pump 3 by using parts from an old washing machine. Nothing. Just that same empty stare and that faint glow in her eyes that the nurses pretended not to notice. Montgomery's official report came out 8 weeks after the incident. 27 pages of technical analysis and bureaucratic language, all leading to the same conclusion: equipment malfunction caused by metal fatigue in critical cooling system components, exacerbated by operator stress and possible hallucinations brought on by prolonged exposure to low-level electromagnetic radiation. My testimony got 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs to describe what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, what had really happened that night. And even those 3 paragraphs made it sound like I'd imagined the whole thing. Witness reported unusual visual phenomena consistent with stress-induced confusion. The report said, no physical evidence supports claims of anomalous luminescence or unexplained system behaviors. No physical evidence, right? I resigned 3 months later. Didn't really have a choice, if I'm being honest. Word gets around in a business like nuclear power. Guy who claims he saw glowing lights and talking voices probably isn't someone you want monitoring your reactor core. Doesn't matter how many years of clean service you've got behind you. Doesn't matter how many emergency situations you've handled without breaking a sweat. One night of telling the truth about what you saw, and suddenly you're the guy who can't be trusted with important responsibilities. I moved downstate after that. Found work at a chemical plant outside Kalamazoo. Nothing fancy, just monitoring systems and filing reports. Different kind of machinery, same basic principles. Keep things running smooth, watch for problems, follow procedure when things go wrong. Quiet work, predictable work. But some nights, driving home on Highway 31, I take the long way around Lake Michigan. Not for any particular reason, just curiosity, I guess, habit, and sometimes when the conditions are just right. Clear sky, no moon, ice thick enough to walk on. I catch a glimpse of something moving beneath the surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up on cameras or convince skeptics. Just a faint glow, maybe 50 feet down, drifting through the dark water like a memory of light, patient. Eternal, waiting for someone else to build something powerful enough to draw it back toward the surface, waiting for the next source of energy, the next opportunity to rise from the depths and touch the world above. I know what I saw that night. I know what happened to Brooke, what happened to the reactor, what's still out there beneath the ice. The truth that no one will believe. But truth doesn't stop being true just because people won't listen to it. And some nights, when I'm driving past the lake and I see that faint luminescence moving through the water, I remember what it felt like to have something vast and ancient speaking inside my head with my supervisor's voice. I remember, and I know it's still there, still waiting.